America is exceptional because we put a constitutional harness on the reach and the power of the state. That's why it's so important to have judges who respect that harness and that limitation on the reach and power of the state, because that elevates individual liberty.
But some people warn that there are steps being taken to essentially steal our vote. For example, there are attempts by the left to shoot down laws that would require a voter to show an identification of some kind.
I think that the left has just been so disingenuous and quite frankly a little condescending when it comes to the ballot security debate. They talk about lower income voters, specifically African Americans. Whenever these laws come up that talk about mandating IDs, voter IDs being shown before you can cast your vote, the left will actually argue that African Americans aren't smart enough and they don't have the capabilities to get identification to present at the polls.
The left claims requiring voter IDs is part of a racist plan to suppress minority votes. But the evidence shows exactly the opposite.
In America, you have to have an identification to fly, to buy alcohol, to drive a car. Voting in an election is one of the more important things that an American citizen can do, and there should be a unanimous support for voter identification. Without voter identification, we're more likely to have electoral fraud, and that can swing elections in key areas.
Studies have shown that after introduction of voter ID laws, there's no decrease in voter participation, particularly among minorities. Case in point, in Georgia, in 2007, they introduced a very strict voter ID law. In 2008, they increased the minority vote by 30%. Of course, Barack Obama was on the ballot, so that explains the popularity of voting at that time. But if you look at subsequent elections, the Georgia share of the vote increased by minorities from 2006 to the 2014 election. And more recently, in 2018, the minority vote increased yet again. It's not really logical to say that minorities are somehow incapable of providing the same identification as anybody else. In fact, it's downright racist to say they're incapable and not competent, like adults, to get an ID to vote.
We show IDs for basic things like getting on a plane or cashing a check. So why would it be so shocking that identification would be required for voting? Many suspect it's so that false votes can be cast. Critics note that the battle for honest elections is a battle on behalf of we the people, not some sort of ruling class.
The left has a real pessimism in us, the people, to make decisions for ourselves and to manage our own lives for us. While people on the right typically believe that everyday people can do a much better job running their lives and their families and their businesses than the federal government. I do think it's important, and I think you're seeing more and more states, especially purple states, adopt voter ID laws, and they start to improve for conservatives just shortly after passing those laws.
Expanding suspicious votes for the left also seems to be the strategy undergirding open borders proposals, giving votes to non-citizens.
You know, the left has proven that it believes in voters without borders. You know, not only do they believe in a nation without borders and the obligation to protect its borders, they believe in voters without borders. And so they're into vote harvesting, they're into loosening the rules. Simple rules like voter ID, you know, are being adopted, but also being resisted by left-leaning groups who are not in favor of a rules-based culture, but who in fact thrive off of chaos.
The left has deployed a number of strategies to literally steal the vote. One thing is to allow millions of illegal immigrants into the country, not keep track of them, and then weaken the voting laws. And in the book, I go through a number of ways they do this.
And attempts to expand the voter rolls to include people most likely to vote to the left don't end there.
Certain states are more lenient when it comes to letting convicted felons vote. And there are certain states right now that are actually considering allowing inmates to cast votes. And so it's really important that because the states are allowed to determine who gets to vote, that we limit their ability to flood the national elections with anyone. California should only be able to really have an impact on California. We don't want California telling voters in Virginia or Ohio or Colorado how to vote and how to live their lives.
Another technique used by the left to steal votes is to make sure that voter registration rolls are not clean, accurate, and up to date. They fight efforts to clean up the voter rolls. And I know this from having worked for the American Civil Rights Union, which has filed suit in several counties in Mississippi and Texas that had more registered voters than there are eligible living adults living in those counties. Same in Broward County, Florida.
After the midterm elections in 2018, there were some peaceful protests outside of the office of the Broward Supervisor of Elections because of allegations of attempts to steal the vote.
Now, Broward County is very interesting. It was one of the two counties in the 2000 election between Al Gore and George Bush that figured in prominently to the recounts that finally led to a Supreme Court case. A lot of skullduggery seemed to be taking place, and the Supreme Court finally said, okay, stop, and you have to count it fairly, and we accept the results. The state canvassing board accepted the results and said George Bush had just barely won by 537 votes out of millions cast. Later, a study by a media consortium, including the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, concluded that yes, George Bush had won the election. But boy, they didn't publicize those results.
How do we offset the problem of cheating? By getting so many people to vote their biblical values, it wouldn't matter if some cheat.
We know that overall about 40% of Christians are not registered to vote, and in an election like this, only about 38% of the registered ones will vote. So we're looking at literally only 1 out of 8 choosing the winning candidate in races. When we look at Senate races or governor's races, etc., it's only going to be 1 out of every 8 Americans that chooses the winner. And if Christians would show up in higher numbers, it would be so much easier to elect people to office who have the right values, who will move the nation in the right direction where that God can bless the nation.
The numbers are clear that the number of people in America that identify as Christians is a majority of the country. If they just showed up and voted, they could win every election. There was a case several years back where the first open lesbian mayor of Houston wanted to censor all the sermons of all the pastors in Houston. When you look at it, the combined membership of those churches in Houston is multiple times more than what the vote count was that got this mayor elected in the first place. If they would just show up and vote, and I believe that the good Lord is watching each one of us. Are we going to ignore the problem altogether, or are we going to be part of that small remnant that stands up and says, God, I may or may not be able to turn it around, but you can count on me for trying.